She arrived at Iron Hollow Ranch on the coldest morning of the year, carrying everything she owned in a single satchel, with frost on her collar and old boot leather so cracked it had long stopped keeping the cold out. The ranch hand saw her coming through the snow and laughed before she even reached the gate. "A woman that size out here? In this weather?" The foreman crossed his arms and told her to turn around and go back to wherever she came from. Naomi Ashcroft looked at him, not angry, not flinching, not begging, and said she wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for work. That silence that followed, that's where this story begins. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The temperature had fallen hard the night before, dropping fast after sundown the way Montana cold does in late December. Not gradually, not with warning, just a sudden, ruthless plunge that turned mud to iron and breath to vapor before a man could even pull his coat closed. By morning, the sky was a flat, pale nothing, and the wind off the mountains came in low and mean, cutting through every gap in every wall on the property. Elias Grundy, the foreman of Iron Hollow Ranch, stood on the porch of the main bunkhouse, with a tin cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He was a broad man, maybe 55, with a face like old rawhide, and a manner that made younger men stand up straight without being told. He had run this place for going on 6 years. He knew the sound of every squeaking hinge, every horse in the barn by their breathing, every hand's boot on the floorboards. He did not like surprises. The figure coming up the road through the snow was a surprise. He squinted. Woman, he thought. Big woman. Alone. On foot. Behind him, one of the newer hands, a wiry kid named Patch, who wasn't much older than 18, stepped out and immediately started laughing. "Lord Almighty," Patch said. "Who is that?" "Don't know," Grundy said. "She walking?" "She walked all the way up from the road in this?" 2 more men appeared at the bunkhouse door, drawn by the cold air and the sound of something worth commenting on. Clyde, who had been at the ranch long enough to have bad habits about the way he talked to people. Dutch, who mostly followed Clyde's lead in everything. Both of them looked out at the approaching woman and started talking in low voices that they didn't bother lowering much. "That's a lot of woman," Clyde said. Dutch made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Naomi Ashcroft walked up the path between the fence posts and stopped at the porch steps. She was maybe 26, with dark hair tucked under a wool cap that had seen better winters. Her coat was patched at both elbows, and the collar was mended with thread that didn't quite match. She was carrying a small leather satchel over one shoulder and her boots. Grundy noticed this. Noticed it the way a man notices details when he's been in charge of people long enough. Her boots were worn through on the outside sole edge, the kind of wear that comes from months of walking on bad ground. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps. She didn't try to climb them. She just looked up at Grundy and waited, which told him something. "Help you?" Grundy said. "I'm looking for work," she said. Her voice was even, not timid, not aggressive, just plain and steady, like she'd said this before and wasn't afraid of the answer, whatever it turned out to be. "What kind of work?" "Cook," she said. "I heard your cookhouse has been without someone since September." Grundy studied her. This was true. Their cook, a man named Fergus, who'd been with the ranch 4 years, had broken his leg bad in October and gone back to his sister's place in Billings to recover. They'd been rotating cooking duties among the hands since then, which meant the food had been mediocre at best and actively terrible most of the time. 2 men had already complained loud enough that the ranch's absentee owner, whoever he was, would eventually hear about it. "You cooked before?" Grundy said. "Yes." "Where?" "Cattle camp outside Havre for 2 seasons. Boarding house in Lewistown before that. Before that, my family spread up near the Canadian line." Patch was still grinning. Clyde said something to Dutch too low for Grundy to catch, but both of them snickered. "Pay them no mind," Grundy said to Naomi, with a flatness that wasn't quite an apology, but wasn't an endorsement either. "I'm not," she said. He looked at her for another moment. She met his eyes without any drama. No anger, no pleading, just waiting. "Cookhouse is in rough shape," he said finally. "Nobody's properly maintained it since Fergus left. Stove's been acting up. Wood supply isn't where it should be. I'd need to see what I'm working with." "You'd need to sleep somewhere. Hands are in the bunkhouse. Ain't appropriate." "Is there a room off the cookhouse?" "Used to be. Probably needs cleaning." I can clean it. Grundy turned and looked at the other men behind him. They were all watching. He could see a few more faces in the bunkhouse window, men who'd gotten up for breakfast and were now watching this instead. "Walk with me," he said to Naomi. She came up the steps and fell in beside him. Clyde and Dutch stepped aside, but not generously. Naomi walked past them without acknowledgement. She didn't look at them, didn't flinch, didn't change her pace. Grundy noticed this too. Chess. The cookhouse was a long, low building set 20 yards north of the main bunkhouse, connected by a covered walkway that didn't offer much shelter, but was better than nothing. Grundy pushed open the door, and the smell hit them both. Old grease, cold ash, the particular staleness of a room that hadn't had a fire in several days. It was a mess. Not catastrophic, but bad. The long table was cluttered with tin plates that hadn't been properly washed. The floor near the stove had accumulated a black grime from a winter of careless use. The stove itself, a massive iron range that must have weighed 400 pounds, had a cracked seal on the left firebox door that caused it to burn inefficiently and put out a choking smoke when the wind came from the north. Supply shelves were disorganized, bags of flour and cornmeal stacked without order, canned goods mixed with tools, a coil of rope sitting on top of a sack of dried beans for reasons no one had bothered to explain. The back wall had a narrow door leading to what had been Fergus's room. Grundy pushed it open. Small bed frame, no mattress, one window with a cracked pane stuffed with a rag. Cold came through the gap in the rag like a slow blade. "That's it," Grundy said. Naomi stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at it without expression. Then she walked back into the main cookhouse and stood in the center and looked at the stove, at the shelves, at the table. "Stove seal needs replacing," she said. "Yeah. I'll need to know what supplies you have on hand. I'll need access to the root cellar and the smokehouse. I can arrange that. And I'll need firewood. Enough to run this thing properly, not just keep it alive." She tilted her head at the iron range. "If you're banking a fire overnight on green wood to save wood, you're losing more efficiency than you're saving." Grundy was quiet for a moment. "Fergus used to say the same thing." Then Fergus knew what he was talking about. Grundy looked at her one more time. This woman in her patched coat standing in a cold, filthy cookhouse she'd never set foot in before, already diagnosing what was wrong with it like she was reading a map. "Trial period," he said. 2 weeks. You prove you can handle it. We talk about staying on through the rest of winter." "That's fair," she said. "Whoops." The hands were watching when she walked back out with Grundy. There were 9 of them at Iron Hollow currently. More in summer when driving and branding and the full work of the ranch was underway. But a smaller winter crew to maintain livestock, feed, and fencing through the hard months. 9 men, and every one of them had an opinion already formed. Patch had moved past laughing to a kind of fascinated staring, the way young men do when they don't have the manners yet to pretend indifference. Clyde had his arms crossed. Dutch had his thumbs in his belt. There was a man named Arlo who was older than Clyde and meaner, who hadn't said anything yet, but whose silence felt loaded. "This is Naomi Ashcroft," Grundy said to the group. "She'll be taking over the cookhouse on a trial. Show some respect." A few of the men nodded. Clyde didn't move. Arlo looked at her the way men look at something they've already decided isn't worth their time. And then there was one man standing slightly apart from the rest, near the corner of the bunkhouse porch, who wasn't doing any of those things. He was leaning against the wall with his arms loosely crossed, and his hat pulled low enough that she couldn't see his eyes clearly from where she stood, but she could feel him looking. Not the way the others were looking, not with amusement or dismissal. Something else. Quiet. Steady. Like he was paying a different kind of attention entirely. His name, she would later learn, was Gideon Hale. He was one of the senior hands, not a foreman, not in any official position, but the kind of man that other men tended to orient themselves around without quite being able to say why. He was maybe 30, lean, with the particular stillness of a person who had learned long ago how not to waste energy on unnecessary movement. He wore a gray wool coat, and his hands, when they weren't working, were usually in his pockets. He didn't say anything. He just watched her with that quiet attention, and then, after a moment, he pushed off the wall and went back inside. The first 3 days were the worst. Naomi got the cookhouse fire going the first night, using the last of the decent hardwood she could find in the supply barn. She repacked the cracked door seal on the stove using a mixture of ash paste and clay she'd seen used before in a boarding house kitchen. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it held heat better. She cleaned the table and the floor and the shelves. She found a mattress frame in the barn loft and pulled it down herself, getting it through the narrow door of her back room by tilting it at angles she'd mapped in her head before she started. She slept in her coat the first night because she hadn't managed to get a mattress tick yet, and the bare frame was cold. She was up before 4 the next morning to start breakfast. The men came in at 6:30. What she'd made was simple: fried salt pork, pan biscuits, gravy that had actual substance to it, and a pot of coffee that was properly made, not the thin, overextended version that had been standard since September. She'd gone through the supply inventory the night before with a lamp and a piece of paper and found they had more than she'd expected. Whoever had been managing supplies had at least kept them stocked, even if no one was using them well. The men ate without talking much, which was normal. Ranch work made for quiet breakfasts, men still waking up, bodies still reconciling themselves with another cold day. Clyde was the first one to make a comment. "Biscuits are dense," he said. Naomi was at the stove with her back to the room. "Altitude does that," she said. "I'll adjust." "Fergus used to soak the pork overnight. Take the salt down." "I know," she said. "Wasn't time last night. I'll do it tonight for tomorrow." There was a pause. "Gravy's all right," Dutch offered, which from Dutch apparently counted as high praise because Patch looked at him like he'd said something remarkable. Gideon came in last, after most of the others had filled their plates and taken their seats. He poured his own coffee. She noticed this, that he didn't wait to be served, and took a seat at the far end of the table with his plate. He ate without commentary. When he was done, he stood up and brought his plate and cup to the wash basin himself. "Stove's drawing better," he said quietly, not to the room, just to her as he set the dishes down. She looked at him. "Repacked the door seal." He nodded. "I figured. Didn't know that fix for it." He went out. She stood there for a moment, surprised, not by what he'd said, but by the matter-of-factness of it. Like she was just a person who'd solved a problem and he was just acknowledging it. By the end of the first week, the food had noticeably improved. She'd gotten into a rhythm with the stores, figured out what she had to work with, learned the particular preferences of the men through observation rather than asking. Arlo liked things saltier than most people. Patch would eat anything, but had a particular enthusiasm for anything sweet. So she started putting dried apple pieces in the morning porridge when she had them. Dutch had a bad back tooth and didn't say anything about it. But she noticed the way he avoided chewing on the right side and started cutting the harder things smaller without comment. The cold remained brutal, the kind of cold that made the cookhouse the center of everything. Every man found a reason to spend a few extra minutes there in the morning or at midday because it was the warmest place on the property. Naomi stoked the fire early and kept it steady, and the room became something it hadn't been in months, a place people actually wanted to be. But the commentary from Clyde and Arlo didn't stop. They had a way of talking about her that wasn't always directed at her, but was always meant to be heard. Comments about her size, about the way she walked, about whether a woman built like that was suited to the work. Things said between them in voices loud enough to carry. Things said to Patch in the evenings that they apparently assumed, or perhaps didn't care, would get back to her. Naomi didn't respond. She had learned, somewhere across the years of her life, that responding gave men like that exactly what they wanted, proof that they had power over you. She did her work. She did it well. She went to her room at night and did not give them the satisfaction of tears, at least not where anyone could see. On the 8th day, she found that someone had chopped a full cord of hardwood and stacked it in the covered alcove beside the cookhouse door. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't mentioned it to Grundy. She looked at the wood for a moment, then looked around, and there was nobody visible. That evening, she saw Gideon coming out of the barn with his gloves off, turning them inside out and slapping them against his thigh to knock the chips loose. She walked over to him. "Was that you?" she said. "The wood." He looked at her. "Stove like that needs hardwood, not that mixed lot you had." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She looked at him for a moment. He had a straight, unhurried way of meeting her eyes, no performance in it. He wasn't doing her a favor to make her feel indebted. He wasn't doing it to make himself look good to anyone. He just did it because it needed doing. "Thank you," she said. He gave a single nod and walked back toward the bunkhouse. The trouble with Boone Cutter had been building since the first day, though she hadn't known his name until the second week. Boone was not part of the regular winter crew. He'd come in off the range with two other men, Decker and Silas, driving a small group of cattle that had drifted too far north in a storm and needed to be brought back to the lower pastures. Grundy had hired them on as short-term hands, the kind of arrangement common in winter when extra labor was occasionally needed. Boone was the kind of man who filled a room the wrong way. Loud, fast with his opinions, the sort who established himself in any new situation by immediately making clear who he found beneath him. He saw Naomi on his second day at Iron Hollow, and something in him decided she would be useful for that purpose. It started with comments at meals. Then it escalated to comments made while she was serving, things said directly to her that were designed to draw a reaction. She gave him nothing, but Boone wasn't the kind of man who stopped when he wasn't getting what he wanted. He was the kind who escalated. It happened in the cookhouse on a Tuesday morning. She was clearing plates from the table after breakfast. Most of the men had already gone out to work. Boone was still at the table with Decker, both of them slow to leave. Naomi was moving around the table, and she had to pass behind Boone's chair to reach the far end. What she didn't expect was his hand. He reached out and grabbed her arm, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to stop her, which was the point. He turned in his chair and looked up at her with a grin that had nothing friendly in it. "You always in this much of a hurry?" he said. She looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. "Let go of my arm," she said, flat, quiet, completely steady. "I'm just talking to you." He hadn't let go. "You're not talking to me. You're stopping me from doing my work. Let go." "She thinks she's something," Decker said to Boone, grinning. Boone looked her up and down in a slow, deliberate way that was designed to make her feel small. "I don't think you're in any position to be making demands," he said. "A woman like you ought to be grateful anyone's paying her any attention." "Last time," Naomi said. "Let go of my arm." Boone opened his mouth to say something else. And then Gideon was in the room. She hadn't heard him come in. He must have been in the covered walkway or close to the door, because he was there suddenly, standing 2 feet behind Boone's chair with his arms at his sides and his face completely calm. "Take your hand off her," Gideon said. His voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that was worse than loud. Boone turned around slowly, keeping his hand on Naomi's arm for 1 extra second to make a point. Then he let go and turned to look at Gideon. "Easy," Boone said, with the confidence of a man who'd been in these situations before and had usually come out the better of them. He was bigger than Gideon, heavier through the chest and shoulders. He stood up from his chair. "Just talking." "You're not," Gideon said. "I don't think this is your business." "It is." Boone looked at Decker. Something passed between them, the quick communication of men who've worked trouble together before. Then Boone looked back at Gideon and decided something. What happened next was fast, and mostly not what Boone had planned. He swung first, which Gideon apparently anticipated because he wasn't where the swing expected him to be. What followed wasn't pretty. It wasn't the kind of fight that happens in stories, all grace and clean moves. It was a few seconds of brutal, efficient, close-range work. And when it was over, Boone was on the floor with his face turned to the side, and Gideon was standing over him breathing slightly harder than normal, but otherwise appearing largely undisturbed. Decker hadn't moved. The sound had brought 2 or 3 of the other hands to the doorway. Grundy appeared a moment later, taking in the scene with the expression of a man who had seen too many things in his life to show much surprise. Gideon turned to Grundy. "Boone's done," he said. Not a question. Not a request. Grundy looked at Boone on the floor, then at Naomi, then at Gideon. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "He is." Later, after Boone and Decker had gathered their things and ridden out, Naomi was alone in the cookhouse restoring the order that the morning's disruption had broken. She worked steadily, setting chairs back where they belonged, finishing the clearing she'd been in the middle of, starting the prep work for the midday meal. Gideon came back. He didn't say anything right away. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then came in and sat down at the near end of the table, not asking for anything, just there. Naomi kept working. "You all right?" he said finally. "Yes." He grabbed my arm, that was all. She paused. "I would have gotten free." "I know," Gideon said, and something in the way he said it, the plain, uncomplicated certainty of it, made her throat tighten unexpectedly. Not because it was kind, because it was true. He wasn't saying it to make her feel better. He was saying it because he believed it. She kept her back to him until the tightness passed. "You've been here before," he said quietly. Not Iron Hollow. She understood what he meant. The situation. People using her appearance as a license to treat her like she didn't have the same standing as anyone else. "Most places," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him shift his weight on the bench. "I'm sorry," he said. She turned around and looked at him. The apology was unexpected, and unexpected things threw her more than direct attacks. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I know. I'm still sorry that it keeps happening." She looked at him for a long moment. This strange, quiet man who chopped her wood without being asked, and stepped into a fight with the same ease another man might step off a porch, and now sat in her cookhouse apologizing for a world he hadn't made. "I've been managing a long time," she said. "I know," he said again. "Doesn't make it right." She didn't answer that. She turned back to the stove and picked up the iron spoon and started moving things around a pot that didn't actually need stirring. Outside, the wind came off the mountains again, pressing against the cookhouse walls with its old, indifferent weight. The day moved forward. The pot simmered. The fire held. Naomi Ashcroft stood in the kitchen she had made her own and worked, the way she had always worked, with her whole body and all her attention, while the world made up its mind what she was worth. By the end of the second week, her trial period was up. Grundy came to the cookhouse after supper and stood in the doorway the way he did when he had something official to say. "You've done good work," he said. "Thank you. The men are eating better than they have in months. The stove's actually working right. The room's clean." He paused. "Few of them had things to say about you that I won't repeat, but most of them are coming around." "Most," she said. "Yeah, most. That's what you get on a working ranch." He scratched the back of his neck. "Anyway, if you're willing to stay on through the winter, the position's yours." She nodded. "I'm willing." He started to go, then stopped. "One more thing," he said. He turned back and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something less controlled than his usual manner. "There'll be a meeting tomorrow morning. Whole crew. The owner of Iron Hollow is sending someone, maybe coming himself. Been a long time since anyone around here actually met him." "What's that got to do with me?" "Might be nothing," Grundy said. He looked at her steadily. "Might be everything." He left. Naomi stood in the empty cookhouse with the last of the evening fire settling in the grate and that word hanging in the air, everything, and she had no way to know yet what it meant. But something in her, some instinct honed across years of arriving in new places and reading the temperature of rooms, told her that tomorrow morning was going to change something. She banked the fire carefully, the way she always did. Not too high, not too low, enough to hold through the night. Then she went to her small room and lay down on her mattress in her coat, staring at the crack in the window pane where the rag wasn't quite enough, and listened to the wind off the mountains press against Iron Hollow Ranch like it was looking for a way in. It hadn't found one yet. She didn't sleep well. The wind kept finding new angles against the cookhouse walls, and the crack in the window pane let in a thin, persistent draft that the rag didn't fully stop no matter how she repacked it. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to Iron Hollow settle around her, the creak of the barn, the occasional shift of a horse, the distant sound of something loose on the roof knocking against itself in the gusts. Might be everything. Grundy wasn't a man who chose words carelessly. She'd known him 2 weeks, which wasn't long, but it was long enough to understand that he said less than he thought and meant more than he said. The fact that he'd offered that much was itself a kind of warning. She turned onto her side and stared at the dark wall and tried to reason through what she actually knew. The owner of Iron Hollow was coming, or sending someone. Nobody around here had met him in a long time. That was strange for a working ranch, a place with a winter crew and livestock and operational costs that needed managing. Absentee owners weren't unheard of on the frontier, but they were usually represented by a managing partner, someone with authority who appeared regularly. Grundy ran the day-to-day. That much was obvious. But Grundy answered to someone. She didn't know what any of that had to do with her. She gave up on sleep before 4, which was her usual hour anyway, and got up and started the fire. By the time gray light was showing through the cracked pane, she had biscuits in the oven and salt pork curing in the cast iron and coffee strong enough to matter. She worked by feel as much as sight, the way you do in any kitchen after you've been in it long enough, reaching for things without looking, knowing how much heat was needed by the sound of the fat in the pan. The men came in quieter than usual. She noticed it. There was a particular kind of quiet that happened when people knew something significant was coming, when they were holding their behavior slightly more carefully than normal. Even Clyde, who'd been running a low-grade campaign of small hostilities since she'd arrived, came in without commentary. Took his plate, sat down. Gideon came in near the end of the group, same as always. He poured his coffee, he sat, he ate. He didn't look at her differently than he ever did, and she found that steadying, the simple consistency of it. Grundy ate quickly and was out the door first. The meeting, apparently, was after breakfast. Nobody had told her whether she was expected to be there or to stay in the cookhouse. She cleared the table, washed the plates, and told herself it didn't matter. She had work to do regardless. She was scrubbing the cast iron when she heard boots on the cookhouse steps. It was Arlo, older, sparse with words, who had treated her with a particular variety of contempt that was quieter than Clyde's but sat heavier because it came from a man who was supposed to know better. He came in without knocking, which was technically his right since this was the ranch cookhouse, not her private home, but it had the feel of a small, deliberate rudeness. "Grundy wants you over at the main house," Arlo said. She set the cast iron down and dried her hands on her work apron. "All right." "Don't know why," Arlo said, and she could hear in his voice that this bothered him, that she'd been included in something that he thought she shouldn't be included in. She didn't say anything to that. She took off the apron, straightened her coat, and went out. The main house at Iron Hollow was bigger than the bunkhouse, but not grand. A 2-story log structure that had been built to last rather than to impress, with a wide front porch and windows that faced south to catch what winter sun there was. She'd seen it from outside, but never been in it. That was where owners stayed when they visited, she assumed. That was where Grundy had his small office off the front room. She walked up to it with her hands in her pockets. The porch was empty. She knocked. Grundy opened the door. He looked at her steadily for a moment, then stepped back to let her in. The front room was warm, a proper fire going in the stone hearth, the first real warmth she'd felt that wasn't coming from a cook stove. There were several ranch hands already there. Patch, standing near the wall trying to look like he was comfortable. Clyde, with his arms crossed, Dutch beside him, a few others standing in the spaces around the room. Gideon was standing near the far wall with his back partially to the room, looking at a map that was pinned above the fireplace. He had his coat on, hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way a man does when he's thinking about something else. "Close the door," Grundy said. She pulled the door closed behind her. Grundy moved to the center of the room. He looked like a man who had been told something that morning that had rearranged a few of his assumptions and was still integrating it. "I'm going to keep this plain," he said, addressing the group but not looking at anyone in particular. "Some of you have been here longer than others. Some of you have questions you've been holding for a while. The fact of it is, Iron Hollow has an owner who's been present on this property for some time. Not distant, not absent. Present. Every day." The room went quiet in a different way than before. Not the careful quiet of men holding their behavior. The stunned quiet of men who have just realized they don't know something they thought they knew. Clyde's arms came uncrossed. He looked around the room, then at Grundy. "What are you saying?" Clyde said. Grundy looked toward the far wall. Gideon turned around. He wasn't holding his hat anymore. He'd set it on the windowsill beside him, and he stood with his hands at his sides, facing the room, with an expression that was the same expression he always had, direct, unhurried, showing nothing it didn't mean to show. But there was something different in the set of his shoulders. He wasn't standing like a hand who'd been called in from the cold. He was standing like a man who was on his own ground. "It's me," Gideon said. "Iron Hollow is mine." The silence stretched out long enough to become uncomfortable. Patch made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough, and was neither. Clyde stared. Dutch looked at Clyde as if expecting Clyde to tell him what to do with this information. Arlo, who had come in after Naomi and was standing near the door, said quietly, "Since when?" "Since always," Gideon said. "My father built this place. I've been running it since I was 23, mostly from this property. Grundy handles the operations I don't have direct time for. I work the ranch." He paused. "Same as the rest of you." "You worked alongside us," Clyde said, and the tone had shifted. Not angry exactly, but thrown. You never said, "No," Gideon agreed. "I didn't." "Why?" Gideon looked at him for a moment. "Because it was my choice." He said it without apology, without the kind of explanation that was designed to manage feelings, just the plain fact of it. "I know this place better working it than I would sitting above it. That's how my father ran it. That's how I run it." Naomi stood near the door and didn't say anything. She was watching his face. She'd been trying to catalog this new information against everything she'd observed in 2 weeks. The way he ate alone sometimes, the way other men oriented toward him even when he wasn't talking, the way he'd told Grundy that Boone was done with the simple directness of someone who didn't need permission. She'd thought it was the confidence of a man who'd been on a ranch long enough to know his own authority. She hadn't extended the thought far enough. "There's one more thing," Gideon said, and now his eyes moved across the room and settled on her. She straightened slightly without meaning to. "I knew Naomi before she came here," he said. "The room processed this. Not well," he continued, before that could go somewhere it wasn't meant to go. 3 years ago, a town called Cutter's Ford on the Milk River. I was riding through. I saw something happen." He stopped for a moment. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "I saw 2 men treating her in a public street in a way that no one should be treated, and I had a reason to keep moving, and I kept moving." He wasn't looking away from her when he said it. "I've thought about that since. More than made sense, probably." Naomi's throat had gone tight. She kept her face still. "When she showed up here," he said, "I recognized her. I didn't say anything because I didn't want her position here to depend on me. She deserved to earn it on her own terms. She did." He turned slightly to address the room again. "That's all of it. You have questions? Ask me. You have problems with the way the ranch is run? Same thing. What you won't do is use this conversation as a reason to change how you conduct yourselves toward anyone on this crew." The last sentence had a particular weight to it. Not a threat, more like a fact about gravity, just the way things were going to go. Grundy moved to the front of the room. "All right," he said, in the tone of a man closing a meeting. "Work's still waiting." The men began to shift. The room started sorting itself out. Low voices, the particular social shuffling of a group recalibrating itself around new information. Patch came past Naomi and gave her a look that was some complicated mixture of surprise and sheepishness. Clyde went out without looking at anyone. Dutch followed Clyde. Naomi stayed where she was. When most of the room had cleared, she and Gideon were left near opposite walls, with Grundy still present, straightening something on the table near the hearth. She looked at Gideon. "Cutter's Ford," she said. "Yes. I remember that day." He didn't say anything. "I didn't see you," she said. "I didn't see anyone who was going to help." She said it without accusation. It was just what had been true. "The 2 men left eventually. I was fine." "I know," he said. "You handled it." "Then why?" She stopped. She knew why. She just needed a moment to say the rest. "You've been carrying that for 3 years?" He looked at her with a kind of uncomfortable honesty. It was the kind of thing that sits wrong. When something sits wrong long enough, you stop being able to put it down. She considered this. It was not, she thought, a simple thing. What he'd described. Not guilt exactly. Something more specific than that. Something about a particular moment of failure that a person keeps returning to because it represents something they don't want to be. She understood that. She understood it well enough that she didn't need to say so. "You should have told me," she said, "when I arrived." "I know. It felt like watching," she said. "Those first days. I thought you were just—" She paused. "I didn't know what you were doing." "I was making sure you were going to be all right," he said. "And then I was seeing that you were. And I didn't know how to say the rest without it coming out wrong." Grundy cleared his throat from his side of the room and found a reason to step out the front door, which left them alone in the warm room with the fire snapping. Naomi looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "You chopped the wood," she said. "Yes." "Fixed the step by my door, the icy one. It was going to be a problem. Carried the water barrel last Thursday when the pump was frozen and I couldn't budge it. The pump needed thawing out. I did that too, the next morning." She looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm not a project," she said. "I'm not something that needs fixing." "No," he said simply. "You're not. But that doesn't mean nobody's allowed to help you with a water barrel." She opened her mouth, closed it. The fire settled in the hearth, sending a soft crack into the quiet room. "That's different," she said finally. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She thought about that. She thought about the difference between being treated like a burden and being treated like a person who sometimes needed a hand with a frozen water pump. It was a real difference. She knew it was real. She'd just spent so much of her life not receiving the second kind that she'd stopped expecting it. "The position," she said, returning to solid ground. "Grundy offered me the position through winter." "I know. I told him to." "You told him to offer it." "I told him to offer it if she earned it," Gideon said. "Those were my exact words." She thought about that. It was technically a fair distinction. She'd still earned it. Grundy had said as much, and she knew it was true. But the knowledge that Gideon had been behind it sat uneasily with her idea of what she'd done on her own. "I would have moved on," she said, "if he'd said no at the 2-week mark. I had other options." "I know," Gideon said. "You said that the first morning when you knocked on the door, that you weren't asking for charity." "I believed you then." He paused. "I still do." She stood in the doorway between the front room and the hall, with the cold coming off the wood behind her and the heat from the hearth in front of her, and she wasn't sure what to do with any of this. The morning had rearranged too many things. The man she'd been observing for 2 weeks, trying to read at a safe distance, had turned out to be something she hadn't accounted for. Not a stranger doing small kindnesses for unclear reasons, but a man with a specific history, a specific failure he was trying to sit with honestly, and a property he'd built his life around. She wasn't sure if that made things simpler or more complicated. Probably more complicated. Things usually were. She pulled her coat closer, which she hadn't realized she'd needed to do, and looked at him one last time. "I should get back," she said. "Midday meal won't make itself." "No," he agreed. "It won't." She went out the front door and down the porch steps into the cold, and behind her she heard the door settle into its frame, and ahead of her was the covered walkway, and the cookhouse, and the work that was waiting, steady and requiring, the way work always was. The sky above Iron Hollow was still the same pale flat, nothing it had been all morning, but something in the air felt different from when she'd walked over. She couldn't have put exactly a name to it, just different. The way a room feels after the windows have been open and closed again. Same room, but the air has turned over once, and the staleness is gone. She went back to her kitchen and built the midday fire up and started working. Through the single window above the prep table, she could see the yard, and after a while she saw Gideon come down off the main house porch and cross toward the barn, moving the same way he always moved, steady, no wasted motion, his breath showing white in the cold air. He disappeared through the barn doors. She turned back to the stove. The days after the meeting had a different texture to them, not dramatic. Nothing at Iron Hollow changed overnight. The cold was still the same cold, the work was still the same work, and the men were still the same men with the same habits and the same frictions they'd had before. But something in the arrangement of things had shifted slightly, the way a load shifts when it's redistributed more evenly. You don't always see the difference. You feel it in how the whole thing carries. Clyde had gone quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of a man recalculating, figuring out where he stood now that the ground had moved under him. He still ate her food without comment, which she took as a kind of neutral ground. He didn't do what he'd been doing before. The low comments, the things said loud enough to carry. Whether that was because he'd reconsidered or because he didn't want to test what Gideon would do about it now that the context had changed, she couldn't say. Either way, the silence was preferable. Patch, for his part, seemed genuinely embarrassed. He was 18 and hadn't yet developed the skill of carrying his mistakes without letting them show on his face. He came in for breakfast on the morning after the meeting and sat down and looked at his plate and said, not to anyone in particular, "I want to say I'm sorry for how I behaved when you first arrived." Naomi was at the stove. She turned to look at him. He was red from his collar to his hat line. "You laughed," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You kept laughing for about 3 days." "Yes, ma'am, I did." He cleared his throat. That's not something I'm proud of. I didn't think about it the right way, and I should have known better, and I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. He was miserable with it, which meant he'd actually sat with it overnight and not just decided to apologize because it was socially useful. I appreciate that, she said. She turned back to the stove. Don't do it again. No, ma'am. And stop calling me ma'am. My name is Naomi. Yes. He stopped himself. Okay. That was the closest thing to a resolution she got with any of them, and she understood that was how these things went. You didn't get speeches, you got small corrections, quiet acknowledgments, the incremental work of people deciding to be better than they'd been. You took what came and you kept working. The cookhouse had become what she'd intended it to become, which was the center of the ranch's daily life in the way it always should have been. People came in not just for meals, but in between. Patch to refill his coffee, Dutch to stand near the stove for a few minutes when his hands got too cold to work, Arlo when he needed to talk through a supply issue with her because she'd become, by necessity and inclination, the person who knew what was on the shelves and what wasn't. Gideon came in every day the same as he always had. He didn't treat her differently now that the context had changed. He didn't become solicitous or careful with her. He was just himself, direct, economical, present when there was a reason to be and elsewhere when there wasn't. She respected this more than she could easily explain. It would have been easy for him to overcorrect, to turn what he'd done in Cutter's Ford into a debt he was perpetually paying. He didn't do that. He just came in, drank his coffee, had his meals, and occasionally lingered long enough to talk. The talking had changed, not in quality, they'd always talked directly, but in frequency. She found herself less guarded around him than she'd been in those first 2 weeks when she'd been watching him from a careful distance. He asked questions the way practical people ask questions, not to fill silence, but because he actually wanted to know the answer. He asked about the boarding house in Lewistown, about her family's spread near the Canadian line. She asked about how he'd come into the ranch after his father, about the decisions he'd made to run it the way he did instead of the way most owners did. Didn't seem right, he said one afternoon about a week after the meeting. He was sitting at the near end of the table while she was doing inventory on the dry goods shelves. Owning something and never getting your hands in it. My father built this place board by board. He knew every problem with every fence post on this property. That's not the kind of thing you keep from behind a desk in another town. Most men would take the desk, she said, not looking up from her count. Most men, he agreed, without contempt. Just a fact. Doesn't it bother them? When they find out? The hands, he considered. Some. The ones who think authority should announce itself find it uncomfortable. Like I've been watching them. Were you? Sure, he said simply. Same way they were watching each other. Same way you were watching all of us. That's just how people work. She wrote down a number in the margin of her inventory sheet and moved to the next shelf. Arlo still doesn't like me. Arlo doesn't like most things, Gideon said. It's not personal. It feels personal. Yeah, it usually does with Arlo. He paused. He'll come around or he won't. Either way, his opinion of you doesn't determine your place here. That was settled. She didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about what it meant to have your place settled by someone else's declaration, even a declaration made on your behalf. She'd survived on her own authority for a long time. The idea of someone else drawing a line around her and calling it protection was something she was still sorting through. You know what bothers me about that, she said finally. Tell me. It's that the line only holds because you drew it, not because the men here decided to extend me the same basic respect they'd extend anyone else. She kept her eyes on the shelves. If you weren't the owner, if you were just another hand, Clyde would still be doing what he was doing. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Probably, he said. So the thing that changed isn't their behavior, it's the consequence attached to it. That's how it works, he said, without making it sound like he was satisfied with that. Doesn't make it right. But you change what you can change and you work with what the rest of it actually is, not what you wish it was. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that steady attention he had, not uncomfortable, not trying to manage her reaction to what he'd said, just present with it. I know, she said. I know that's how it works. I've always known that. She turned back to the shelves. It still sits wrong. Yeah, he said, it does. That was the thing about talking to Gideon. He didn't try to make things easier than they were. He'd agree with you when he agreed, push back when he didn't, and when something was just genuinely hard, he'd say so and leave it there without trying to wrap it in something more comfortable. She had rarely met men who did that. Most men who liked you wanted to fix whatever hurt, which was sometimes worse than the original problem. The third week of December brought a storm that lasted 2 days. Real storm, not the nagging cold that had been their constant companion, but a hard-driving snow that made outside work impossible and kept everyone inside. The barn animals were tended to in shifts, 2 men at a time fighting through the yard to the barn and back. Everything else stopped. The cookhouse ran continuously. She kept the fire going and the coffee going and produced food at irregular intervals because men who couldn't work still needed to eat and had nothing else to do but come in and sit and wait for the storm to break. It was more work than the normal routine, more demands, less predictability, the constant interruption of someone appearing at the door while she was in the middle of something. But she managed it. She'd managed worse. On the second night of the storm, with the wind pressing hard at every joint in the building, she was alone in the cookhouse past 10, getting a head start on the morning prep because she knew the men would be hungry and restless after 2 days of confinement. She was making bread, working the dough on the flour-dusted table by lamplight, which was meditative work, the kind that let the mind settle into whatever it had been turning over. She heard boots on the steps and then a knock, which was unusual. Most men just came in. "Come in," she said. It was Gideon. He came in with snow on his shoulders and stomped his boots on the mat. "Checking the roof line," he said. "Wanted to make sure nothing was loading up over the cookhouse." "Is it?" "Some. I cleared it. Should be all right." He looked at the dough on the table. "Late to be working." Mornings are easier when the prep's done. He moved to the stove and poured himself a cup of whatever was in the pot. It was the end-of-night coffee, bitter and overstewed, and he drank it without complaint, which told her something about either his taste or his standards. "Sit down if you want," she said. She was working the dough and didn't look up. "You don't have to stand there like you're waiting for something." He sat down at the near end of the table, a few feet from where she was working. The lamplight was warm and the stove was putting out good heat, and outside the wind was doing what it had been doing for 2 days, and neither of them said anything for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was the thing. She'd spent enough time around men who couldn't tolerate a quiet room to recognize when someone was actually at ease in one. "Can I ask you something?" she said, not stopping her work. "Sure. Cutter's Ford. What was it that actually stopped you?" She felt him go still on the other side of the table. "I had a freight contract," he said, "a time-sensitive one. I was already 2 days behind because of weather, and the penalty for a late delivery was significant. I told myself the 2 men would leave, that you'd be fine, that intervening would make it worse." He paused. All of that was at least partially true, but the real reason was that it was easier to keep moving than to stop. She folded the dough and pushed the heels of her hands into it. "Did you actually think I'd be fine?" she said. "Or did you tell yourself that?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I told myself that," he said. She nodded, still working the dough. "I appreciate you saying it that way," she said. "It's what happened." Most people would have stayed with the first version, the one where they were mostly reasonable and circumstance made the decision. "Most people aren't trying to be honest about it," he said. "I've been trying to be honest about it for 3 years. At some point, you stop letting yourself off." She shaped the dough into a round and set it in the bowl to rise overnight, covered it with a clean cloth. Then she dusted her hands on her apron and turned around and leaned against the table behind her and looked at him. He looked back. There was something in the room that had been building across weeks of quiet conversations and shared work and small accumulated moments. She'd been aware of it and had made a point of not looking at it directly, the way you don't look directly at something you're not sure you're ready to name. "I need to say something," she said, "and I need you to just hear it, not fix it." "All right. I've spent most of my life being the person that people look at wrong, either like I'm something to make fun of, or like I'm something that needs handling, or like I'm an inconvenience they're tolerating." She kept her voice even. "You've been treating me like a person, and that's not nothing. That's actually enormous to me, but I need to know whether that's because you feel like you owe me something, or because it's just who you are." The wind pushed against the wall. The lamp flame moved slightly and steadied. Gideon looked at her without rushing his answer. "Boss," he said. "I'm not going to pretend the debt isn't part of it. It is, but it's not most of it." He turned the cup in his hands. "I watched you repack a stove door seal on your second day here with clay and ash because you figured out a solution nobody else had thought of. I watched you learn 9 men's particular preferences inside of a week without asking any of them directly. I watched you not beg, not fold, not perform any version of yourself for people who weren't worth performing for. He set the cup down. That's not someone I'm paying a debt to. That's someone I want to know. Naomi stood against the prep table with her flour-dusted hands and didn't say anything for a moment. That's a careful answer, she said. It's the true one. She pushed off the table and crossed to the stove to check the damper setting for the night. Her back was to him again. I grew up on a working spread, she said. I know what this life is. I'm not going to be somebody's project or somebody's way of making themselves feel better about something they did or didn't do years ago. No, he said. You're not. I mean it. I know you do. A pause. So do I. She adjusted the damper and stood with her hand on it for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned around. I'm going to sleep, she said. He stood up. Good night, Naomi. She looked at him. There was something about the way he said her name. Not weighted with anything, not performing warmth, just the clean use of it like it was a thing that belonged to her and he was giving it back. Good night, she said. He took his coat off the hook by the door, pulled it on, and went back out into the storm. She stood alone in the cookhouse with the fire and the lamp and the covered dough resting in its bowl, and she put her hand flat on the floured table and felt the cold wood under her palm and breathed. She had been in harder places than this. She had kept moving in worse conditions than this. She was still here, not just surviving, but built into the rhythm of this place, necessary to it, known by it in a way that had nothing to do with what she looked like or how much room she took up. That was worth something. She cleaned down the table, banked the fire carefully, took her lamp, and went to her room. The crack in the window pane still let in cold. The rag still wasn't quite enough. She lay down and closed her eyes and listened to the storm work itself out against the walls. And for the first time in a long time, the cold didn't feel like something trying to get in. It just felt like weather. The storm broke on the third morning. It didn't announce itself, just stopped, the way Montana storms sometimes do, like something that had been running hard simply decided it was done. Naomi woke before 4 to the absence of wind, which was its own kind of sound after 2 days of constant noise. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the quiet, then got up and dressed and went to start the fire. The yard outside the cookhouse window was buried. 3 feet of new snow on top of what had already been there. The fence posts reduced to low humps. The covered walkway between the buildings packed solid on the windward side. She could see one set of boot tracks already crossing the yard in the gray pre-dawn light, heading toward the barn. She didn't need to check whose they were. Breakfast that morning was louder than usual. Men coming in from the first barn shift with the particular restless energy of people who'd been cooped up too long and were glad to have real work waiting again. There was more talking, more movement, plates refilled twice. She kept the stove loaded and the coffee strong and stayed out of the conversations that didn't need her in them, which was most of them. She was good at that, being present in a room without requiring anything from it. It was after the breakfast rush, when the room had mostly cleared and she was washing down the table, that Clyde came back in. This was unusual. He'd already eaten and gone out with the others. Coming back alone in the mid-morning wasn't his pattern. She noted it without turning around. He stood near the door for a moment. Something you need? She said. Just coffee, he said, which wasn't true. The pot was on the stove in plain sight, and he'd always poured his own. He came in anyway and poured a cup and stood there drinking it, not sitting down with his back half to her. She kept washing the table. I'm going to say something, he said, and I want you to know I thought about whether to say it or not. Go ahead. I wasn't right, he said, with how I talked about you, talked around you. He stopped. She could hear in his voice that this was costing him something, and that he wasn't entirely sure why he was spending it. It's not like I'm going to pretend I was a bigger man than I was about it, but it wasn't right. She wrung out the rag and draped it over the basin edge. No, she said. It wasn't. Yeah. He drank his coffee, set the cup down. Anyway, he went out. She stood alone in this clean-smelling room and looked at the door he'd just gone through and felt something. Not warmth exactly, not forgiveness in any resolved way. More like acknowledgement. He'd said the thing. She'd received it. That was what it was. She didn't need it to be more than that. She picked up the rag and finished the table. The days between the storm and Christmas moved with the particular rhythm of deep winter ranch work, slow on the surface, relentless underneath. The snow that had fallen needed to be managed, paths cleared, roof lines checked, the weight on the barn roof monitored, water sources kept open against freezing. Cattle in the lower pastures needed daily feed runs. Fencing that had been damaged by the storm's weight needed assessment, temporary repair where permanent repair could wait for spring. Naomi learned the shape of it all not because she was expected to. Her job was the cookhouse, and nobody asked anything beyond that, but because she was paying attention and had always learned things by watching. She started timing the morning meal to the schedule of the feed runs. She started keeping a pot of something hot on the back of the stove in the late afternoon for whenever the men came in from fence work. Because fence work in January cold was the kind of thing that ate you from the outside in, and a hot cup of something simple could matter more than it had any right to. Gideon noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly. He was not a man who named small things unless necessary. But one evening he came in from a long day on the east fence line and found the pot on the back of the stove and poured himself a cup without surprise, and there was something in the ease of it, the way he didn't have to ask, that told her he'd noticed. He sat down. East section, he said. About 400 feet needs full replacement in spring. Pressure from the snow took out 3 posts and the wires kinked beyond salvage on that stretch. That's expensive, she said. It is. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Worth it, though. That fence line is what keeps the north herd from drifting into the Henderson property. Had that problem 3 years ago before I fixed the middle section. Spent 6 weeks in a legal dispute with Henderson's foreman that didn't need to happen. Did you win? Mostly. Lost 2 weeks of Henderson's cooperation on shared water access. He shook his head slightly. Not worth it. Better to have good fences. Good fences, she agreed. They talked like that. Practical things, operational things, the actual substance of what it took to keep a place like this running. She appreciated it. It was the kind of conversation she'd rarely been included in because people had a tendency to assume she was only relevant to the kitchen. Gideon didn't have that tendency. He talked to her the way he'd talk to anyone who was present and paying attention, which was all he seemed to require. It was during one of these conversations, about a week before Christmas, that Arlo walked in. He came in for the afternoon coffee, same as anyone, and he filled his cup and turned around and looked at the two of them at the table, and something moved across his face. Not anger, something harder to read than that. He sat down. Not near them, at the far end of the table. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Arlo said, "I've been thinking about something." Gideon looked at him. "The spring crew," Arlo said. "You're going to need at least 3 more hands for branding and the cattle drive. Maybe 4 if the Henderson agreement on the North Water access holds, and we're running the herd that direction." "I know," Gideon said. "The cookhouse is going to need to scale up." Gideon was quiet. He looked at Arlo steadily. "You saying that because it's an operational question?" Gideon said. "Or are you saying it because you think it makes a point about something?" Arlo turned his cup in his hands. He had the look of a man who had been working himself toward something for a while and had finally gotten there, not entirely sure of the footing. "I'm saying it because it's a real question," Arlo said. He paused. "And because I think she can handle it." He didn't look at Naomi when he said it. He kept his eyes on the table, which told her this was genuinely difficult for him, not performed. "She can handle the scale. I've been watching how she manages this house, and she can handle more than this." The room was quiet. Naomi looked at the side of Arlo's face. He still wasn't looking at her. "Thank you," she said. He turned to look at her then, briefly, with the expression of a man who had done a thing he wasn't sure how to feel about. "It's just operational," he said. "I know," she said. "It's still worth something." He drank his coffee. Nobody said anything else for a moment. Then Arlo stood up and took his cup to the basin and walked out. Gideon looked at her after the door closed. "He's been arguing with himself about you since you got here," he said. "I gathered." "He had a wife," Gideon said quietly. "Years ago. She worked twice as hard as any man he ever knew, and people treated her about the same way this crew treated you when you showed up." He paused. "She died 4 winters back. Fever. He has particular feelings about watching it happen again." Naomi absorbed this. "He could have just said that," she said. "He could have," Gideon agreed. "He's Arlo." She understood. People carried their reasons in different shapes. You didn't always get to see the shape clearly until something shifted and let the light in at a different angle. The week before Christmas brought its own particular pressure. She'd heard Grundy mention that there were two men whose seasonal contracts were coming to an end. Dutch was going back to his family in Helena for the winter holidays, and a quiet hand named Reston, who'd said almost nothing to her the entire time, was moving on to another outfit in the spring. Their departures were unremarkable, ordinary frontier turnover, but they created gaps in the daily rhythm she'd built her schedule around, and she had to adjust. More importantly, they created space for a conversation she hadn't expected. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, 4 days before Christmas. Grundy came to the cookhouse with his account book, which he occasionally did when he needed to go over supply costs. She was cleaning the stove grate, the dirty work that needed doing every week, and produced a particular quality of grime. She was kneeling beside the stove with a wire brush, and her sleeves rolled up when he came in, and she didn't stop working because the grate didn't care about the timing. Grundy sat down and opened his book and went over supply numbers with her for about 20 minutes. The practical discussion of what had been used, what needed ordering, what could wait until spring. Then he closed the book and sat with his hands on top of it. "Gideon wants to talk about your position going into spring," he said. She kept brushing. "All right. Not me. Him. I'm just telling you it's coming." He paused. "He asked me whether I thought you'd stay on past winter. What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know and that he'd have to ask you himself." A pause. "Which he'll do. I just didn't want you to be surprised when it comes up." She sat back on her heels and looked at the grate. It was clean enough. She started reassembling the parts. "Grundy?" she said. "Yeah. Do you think I should stay?" He was quiet for a long moment. She heard him turn a page in the closed book just for something to do with his hands. "I think this is the best-run cookhouse this ranch has had since before I got here," he said. "I think the men work better when they're eating properly and they have somewhere warm to come to at midday. I think you've handled a difficult situation with more composure than most people would have managed." He paused again. "And I think there are things happening on this property that are going to need good people around them. So yes, I think you should stay." She put the last piece of the grate back in place and closed the stove door. "That's a careful way of saying something," she said. "I'm a careful man." She stood up and wiped her hands on her work rag and turned to look at him. He was watching her with the expression of someone who had been paying close attention for some time and had formed a considered opinion. "He's a good man," Grundy said. "Which I say not because it's my job to say it, but because it happens to be true and it seems relevant." "It seems relevant," she repeated, mildly. "I'm just saying what I know," Grundy said, with the dignified expression of a man who had done exactly as much meddling as he'd intended to do. He stood up, put the account book under his arm, and went out. She stood in the cleaned cookhouse with her wire brush in one hand and the work rag in the other, and looked at the far wall and thought about spring. The conversation with Gideon came the next evening after supper when the cookhouse had emptied and the lamp was low. He came in from outside with cold on his coat and stood in the doorway instead of sitting, which was different from his usual manner. She'd noted that he stood when he was working through something. "Grundy told me he talked to you," Gideon said. "He did. She was at the stove, but not doing anything particular with it. He told me you wanted to talk about the spring position." "I do." He came in and closed the door. He didn't sit down. "The ranch runs better with you here. That's not flattery, it's the operational fact. Spring brings a larger crew and more demands on the cookhouse. I need someone who knows the property and knows the men and can scale to it." He paused. "I want you to stay on as the permanent cook. Year-round position, not seasonal. Pay that reflects the actual scope of the work, which is more than what a seasonal hire gets." She listened to all of this. "That's the operational offer," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yeah. Is there a non-operational offer?" The room was warm and the lamp was low, and outside the cold was doing what it did at night in January in Montana, which was press itself against every surface it could find. "I've been thinking about how to say this," he said, "and I keep landing on just saying it directly, which is probably right." He wasn't uncomfortable. He was just careful, the way he was always careful with things that mattered. "I want to know you better, not as the cook, as a person. I don't know what that looks like practically, given what this place is and how it runs, but I know I want it." She looked at him. That's direct, she said. You said you wanted direct. I do. She crossed her arms slowly, not defensively, just thinking. I've been here 6 weeks. I know. That's not very long. No, he agreed. It's not. And you're my employer. Technically, Grundy handles. You're my employer, she said again, without harshness. He was quiet. Yes. Which makes this complicated. Yes, it does. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without flinching, without trying to fill the space with reassurance. He'd said what he meant. He was waiting for her to do the same. I'm not going to make a decision about any of that right now, she said. I need to think about what I want, which I haven't done enough of. Most of my thinking has been about surviving and working and proving something, and I'm not sure I've left enough room in there for what I actually want out of any of this. That's fair, he said. The position I'll take, she said. The permanent position. On my own terms. I want to be clear that I'm here because I'm good at this work, not because of anything else. I know, he said. That was never in question. Then we agree on that. She paused. The rest I need to think about. He nodded. He pulled his coat straight, which he did when he was finishing a thing. One condition, she said before he could move toward the door. He stopped. I want the window in my room fixed, she said. The cracked pane. I've been stuffing a rag in it since December and it's not enough. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I'll get that done tomorrow, he said. Good, she said. Good night. Good night, Naomi. He went out. She stood alone in the warm cookhouse and listened to his boots cross the yard through the snow, slow and steady, until the sound faded. Then she turned down the lamp and sat down at the empty table and put both hands flat on the clean wood surface and held them there. She had never been the kind of person who believed things would simply work out. Life had given her too many examples of things not working out to sustain that particular faith. But she was also, underneath everything, a person who was good at reading what was real, what was solid and what wasn't, what would hold weight and what would fail under pressure. What she'd felt in this room over the last 6 weeks had weight to it. She sat with that for a while, alone in her kitchen, in the ranch that had started to feel like hers. Then she went to bed. The window got fixed the next morning. She heard the sound of it before she saw it. The careful tap of a glazier's tool against old putty. The quiet work of someone doing a precise thing without making more noise than necessary. She was starting the breakfast fire when she heard it, and she went to her room doorway and looked in. And there was Gideon crouched beside the window frame in the gray early light with a pane of new glass and a putty knife, removing the cracked section in pieces small enough not to shatter further. He hadn't knocked. He'd started at first light while she was already up, which meant he'd been up earlier than that, finding the glass somewhere in the supply barn or the main house, cutting it to size. She stood in the doorway and watched him work for a moment. You didn't have to do it yourself, she said. I know how to set glass, he said, not turning around. Patch doesn't. There are other men. There are. He lifted the last piece of the old pane out carefully, but I said I'd do it. She went back to the stove. By the time breakfast was ready, the window was set and the new putty was curing and the draft was gone. She noticed it immediately, the quality of the air in her room when she went to get her work apron. Still cold, but still. Not moving. The rag was in a heap on the floor where he'd left it, which was the only imperfect part of the whole operation. She picked up the rag and put it in the rag pile and didn't say anything about it. Christmas passed quietly at Iron Hollow. She hadn't expected anything particular from it, and didn't get anything particular from it, which was fine. She made a better meal than usual, a beef roast she'd been planning around a cut Grundy had set aside in the smokehouse, dried apple cake that used up the last of the dried fruit from the stores. The men ate with genuine appreciation, which by now was something she could read as real rather than performed. Gideon sat at the end of the table and ate, and didn't make a ceremony of it. Afterward, he and Grundy sat by the stove with their coffee for a long time, talking about spring planning, the fence replacement on the east section, the additional hands they'd need, the Henderson water access agreement that needed to be renegotiated before the snow broke. Naomi cleaned up and listened without appearing to, which was a skill she'd had her whole life. The new year came in with another cold snap, meaner than the December cold, the kind that froze the pump solid 3 mornings running and made the trip from the bunkhouse to the barn a genuine exercise in endurance. She learned to add extra time to her morning prep to account for the pump, boiling water on the stove to thaw the intake pipe before she could fill the coffee pot. It was one more small adaptation in a winter's worth of small adaptations. She had made her decision about Gideon sometime between Christmas and the New Year, though she hadn't announced it to herself in any clean way. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like a gradual recognizing, the way you recognize that a season has actually changed, not on a particular day, but at some point when you look up and the light is different and you realize it's been different for a while. She didn't tell him right away. She sat with it first, turned it over, checked it for cracks, the way she'd checked the stove door seal, looking for the places where it would fail under pressure. She found some. She had never in her adult life been in a relationship of any kind that went the direction she'd hoped. She had a particular wariness built from specific experience, and she didn't intend to pretend that wasn't there. But she also knew what was real and what wasn't. She'd always known that. She told him on a Tuesday evening in early January when the cold snap had broken slightly and the temperature had come up enough that the yard wasn't dangerous. She caught him coming out of the barn after the last check of the evening. He saw her and stopped. "I made my decision," she said. She hadn't planned an approach to this. She was just saying it because it needed saying. He waited. "I'm not going to treat it like it isn't complicated," she said. "Because it is. You're the owner of this property and I work on it. And that's a real thing that doesn't disappear because we decide we want something." She paused. "But I've spent a lot of my life letting the complicated parts of things stop me from having anything at all. And I don't want to do that anymore." He was looking at her with that steady attention of his. "I'm not saying yes to something I don't know the shape of yet," she said. "I'm saying I'm willing to find out what the shape is. Carefully. And if something doesn't work, we say so." "That's fair," he said. "I mean it about the careful part. I know you do." "And I'm still just the cook," she said. "That doesn't change. I'm not going to have the men thinking my position here depends on Naomi." He said her name simply, the way he always did. "I know. Nothing changes about how this ranch runs. Nothing changes about your position or how you earned it." A pause. "The only thing that changes is whether I'm allowed to court you in some reasonable fashion." She looked at him. "Court me," she repeated. "I don't know what else to call it. It's a very formal word. I'm a fairly formal man about some things." She thought about that. There was something almost funny about it, this lean, practical rancher who fixed window glass before sunrise and broke up a fight without raising his voice, using the word court with complete seriousness in a cold barnyard in January. "All right," she said. "All right, you'll allow it, or all right, that's a funny word." "Both," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in that way it did. She went back inside. The cold followed her in and she closed the door against it and stood for a moment in the warm cookhouse with her hand still on the latch. She was not a person who let herself feel things carelessly, but she let herself feel this. January deepened and February came in behind it, brutal and gray, the kind of month that tested whether you actually wanted to be somewhere or had just convinced yourself you did. She learned that about Iron Hollow in February, whether she really wanted to be there when there was nothing romantic about it, when the cold was just cold and the work was just work. And some days the only thing pulling her out of bed at 4 a.m. was the knowledge that the men needed feeding and the stove needed starting. She did want to be there. That was the thing she found out. Even on the days when the pump froze again and Clyde tracked mud through the clean kitchen and she burned the bottom of a pot she'd been heating too fast because she was thinking about something else. Even on those days, she wanted to be in this specific kitchen, in this specific place, doing this specific work. That was new for her. That feeling of being in the right place. She'd been competent everywhere she'd been, but competence wasn't the same as belonging, and she'd known the difference even when she couldn't close it. The courtship, she used the word privately, without irony, because it was his word and it had stuck, was not dramatic. He came in for his coffee in the mornings and sometimes stayed 10 minutes past when he needed to, talking about something real, something happening on the property, or something he'd been thinking about. He learned to tell when she needed the room to herself and left it without comment on those days. She learned that he had a particular frustration with paperwork, the contracts and accounts that Grundy could manage but that still required his signature and attention, and that he put it off in a way that was inconsistent with his usual discipline, which she found humanizing in a specific way she appreciated. She also found out, in February, that he had a temper. It wasn't directed at her. It was directed at a supply contractor out of Great Falls who had shorted the ranch on a winter grain delivery and then disputed the count, costing them 2 weeks and a significant portion of the emergency feed reserve at the worst possible time in the season. She was in the main house when the letter arrived, and when Gideon read it, and she watched the way his jaw set and his hands went still on the page. What followed was controlled but unmistakable, a precise cold anger that came out in the letter he dictated to Grundy for the contractor, and in the conversation he had that evening with Arlo about how to stretch the existing feed supply. He was not careless with it. He didn't throw anything or raise his voice at anyone who didn't deserve it. But it was there, hard and clear under everything. She found she didn't mind it. She'd known men who had no anger at all, and they were usually the ones with no principle underneath either. A man who got angry about a cheat was a man who knew the difference between right and wrong in a concrete way, not just as an abstraction. She told him this. They were in the cookhouse after supper, the tension from the feed situation still in the room, and she said, "You're still thinking about the contractor." "He shorted us 1,400 pounds, Gideon said. "I know. You'll get it resolved." "I'll get more than it resolved. There'll be a penalty clause in the new contract that makes this not worth his time to attempt again." "I know," she said again. She paused. "I wanted to say, the way you handled it today. You were angry and you were entitled to be angry, and you didn't take it out sideways on anybody who didn't earn it." He looked at her with a slightly guarded expression. "That's a low bar. For some men it isn't." He considered this. "Who was the man?" he said carefully. "Who made you think that was worth noting?" She shook her head. "Nobody specific, just accumulated experience." He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him deciding something. "People who treated you badly," he said, "because of how you look." "Mostly, yes. And some who were supposed to be different." She didn't answer that directly. "I'm careful," she said. "That's all I'll say about it. I'm careful because I have reasons to be careful." "I know." He turned his cup in his hands. "I'm glad you told me." "I'm not looking for reassurance," she said quickly. "I'm not giving you reassurance. I'm saying I'm glad you told me because it means you trust me enough to say it, and that matters to me. That's different." She looked at him across the table. "Yes," she said. "It is different." They sat in the quiet kitchen, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds, and outside February continued its indifferent work against the walls of Iron Hollow, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. March came like a loosening. Not warm, not yet, not truly. But the cold had a different quality to it. Not the locked, killing cold of January, but something that moved, that shifted, that acknowledged the existence of another season somewhere ahead. The snow began to compact rather than accumulate. The pump froze less often. The light, when it came at a different angle and stayed a little longer each day. The spring hands started arriving in mid-March. 3 new men on top of the winter crew. Grundy had hired them through a contact in Billings. Men with references and practical experience. Naomi expanded the cookhouse operation before they arrived, reorganizing the supplies, calculating quantities, reinforcing her morning schedule to absorb the additional load. The first morning the full crew sat down for breakfast was the first real test of everything she'd built since December. She fed 11 men without incident, the food hot and adequate, and served on time, the coffee strong, the biscuits better than they'd ever been because she'd finally gotten the altitude adjustment right. The new hands ate without comment, which was all she'd wanted. They didn't know her history or her first 2 weeks here, and she had no interest in them knowing it. She was just the cook. She was good at it. That was the transaction. Arlo, who had come to occupy a particular role in the cookhouse dynamic, reliable, less hostile than he'd been, occasionally almost warm in the gruff way he had, sat at his usual end of the table and ate, and afterward said to no one in particular, "Biscuits are better." "I know," she said. "You figured out the altitude thing." "Weeks ago. I've been saving it." He looked at her. Something shifted on his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that direction. "That's mean," he said. "I thought you'd appreciate the honesty," she said. He made a sound that was actually a laugh, short, surprised, like it had gotten out before he could consider it. He put his cup down and went out, and she watched him go and thought about the long distance between where they'd started and where they were now. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something more practical than that. A mutual recognition of shared ground, arrived at through months of showing up in the same room and doing the same work and finding out that the other person could be counted on. You couldn't engineer that. You couldn't rush it. It just happened, or it didn't, in the time it took. Spring came fully in April. The snow retreated from the lower pastures first, then the yard, then the high ground, pulling back slowly the way things that have been settled all winter reluctantly acknowledge that conditions have changed. The mud came, the particular, pervasive, boot-swallowing mud of a Montana spring thaw, and then, a few weeks after the mud, the first real green at the base of the fence posts and along the south-facing hillsides. She stood in the cookhouse doorway one morning in early April with her coffee, watching the yard in the thin, early light, and there was something alive in the air that hadn't been there since she'd arrived. Not warmth exactly, just the possibility of it. Gideon came across the yard from the direction of the barn and stopped when he saw her in the doorway. "Spring," she said. "Getting there," he said. He came up the steps and stood beside her in the doorway and looked out at the yard. The mud, the retreating snow along the fence line, the high clouds moving fast overhead. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "I want to show you the north section of the property. There's a stretch of land up there that looks a particular way in April when the snow comes off it. I've never shown it to anyone." He paused. "I'd like to show it to you." She looked at him. "That's your version of a significant gesture," she said. "Yes. Most men would do something more elaborate. I'm not most men." "No," she said. "You're not." She looked back out at the yard, at the mud and the retreating winter, and the particular quality of a morning that understood things were about to change. "All right," she said. "Show me." They went the following Sunday, when the week's work allowed for it. Just the two of them on horseback, up the north trail that wound through the timber and came out on the high ground above the ranch. The view from up there was something she hadn't prepared for. The whole of Iron Hollow spread out below, the buildings, the pastures, the creek line cutting through the lower valley, the mountains beyond everything, still white at the peaks. And right at the tree line where they stood, exactly as he'd said, the snow had come off the south slope of the hill and left behind a stretch of ground that had turned green overnight, the exact vivid green of new grass that only exists for a few weeks in early spring before it deepens and settles into summer. She sat on her horse and looked at it. "I come up here every April," he said. "First time I made it up here after my father died, I stood here for about an hour. I didn't know then whether I was going to be able to keep the place. I was 23 and the debt was significant and I had two hands and no real plan." He looked at the green strip of hillside. "But I stood here and I thought, if I lose it, at least I saw this one more time." She looked at him. "You didn't lose it," she said. "No. It took 7 years of doing everything wrong and then finding out how to do it right, and a lot of bad winters, but no." He looked at her. "I don't lose things I decide to keep." The morning was clear, and the air smelled like cold earth and new grass, and somewhere below them a hawk was working the thermals above the valley, tilting slow circles in the still air. She understood what he was saying. She understood that he wasn't just talking about the land. "I'm not something to be kept," she said. Not harshly, just cleanly. "No," he agreed. "You're not. You're someone who might choose to stay." He paused. "Those are different things." They were. She knew they were. She'd spent enough of her life being the former to know exactly how different the latter felt. "I've been thinking about what I want," she said, "the way I told you I needed to." "Have you figured it out?" "Some of it." She looked out over the valley, at Iron Hollow small and solid below them. "I want the permanent position. I want to keep building the cookhouse into what it should be. I want to be a real part of how this place runs. Not background, not just the person who feeds the crew, but someone whose judgment counts." "It does count," he said simply. "It has for months." "I know. I want it to keep being that way." She paused. "And I want to see what this is, between us. Slowly. Without either of us pretending we know how it ends." "That's honest," he said. "It's all I have," she said. "Honesty and work. It's what I've always had." He looked at her for a long moment, with that steady, unhurried attention that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him. "That's enough," he said. That's more than enough. She nodded. She looked back out at the valley. There is a particular thing that happens to a person who has spent most of their life being seen wrong. Seen as a limitation, a joke, a burden, a thing that takes up too much space. What happens is that you begin to see yourself through those eyes, not because you believe it, but because the sheer repetition of it wears grooves in the way you think. You start to expect the diminishment before it arrives. You start carrying it with you even when the room you're in doesn't require it. What Naomi had found at Iron Hollow, slowly and imperfectly, and through a winter that tested every capacity she had, was not a cure for that. There is no cure. The grooves are real, and they run deep, and some mornings you still wake up expecting the worst from the room. But she had found something that sat against it. Not a person, not Gideon, though he was part of it. Not a place, though the ranch was part of it too. What she had found was the accumulated evidence of herself. 6 months of showing up before dawn and doing the work well and handling what came at her and refusing to be made smaller by people who needed her to be. That evidence didn't erase the old grooves. It just added something on the other side of the scale. It was enough to stand on. She turned her horse and started back down the trail, and she heard him follow behind her, and below them Iron Hollow went about its morning. Horses in the near pasture, smoke from the cookhouse chimney, the creek running faster now with the melt. The whole place alive with the particular noise of a working ranch in the first real week of spring. She rode down into it. Not because it was hers in any legal or formal sense, because she had built herself into it, had become necessary to it, had learned the shape of it through one of its hardest seasons. Because there were men in that cookhouse who knew her name and what she was capable of, and extended her the respect she'd earned rather than the contempt she hadn't. Because there was a man riding behind her who had once failed her by keeping moving and had spent 3 years trying to be honest about it, and who had, in the months since, been exactly who he said he was. None of it was clean. None of it was finished. Clyde still had his moods, Arlo was still Arlo, the north fence still needed replacing. The pump would freeze again next winter. There would be days she burned the pot, and days the crew was difficult, and days the cold came back in the night, and made her wonder why she'd ever thought this was a place for her. But she would be here for those days. She rode into the yard at Iron Hollow Ranch in the early morning of an April day, with the mud under the horses' hooves and the green beginning at the edge of everything, and she felt the ground hold under her weight. That was enough. That had always been enough. She got down from the horse, tied it at the post, and went into her kitchen to start the midday fire. The work was waiting. It always was. And for the first time she could honestly remember, so was she.